I'm Vanessa Rogers. I'm a coordinator of music history over here in the Department of Music at Rhodes College. It is my pleasure to welcome you tonight to the 2019 Springfield Music Lecture. The Springfield Music Lectures program was established at Rhodes through a bequest by the late John Murray Springfield, a member of the cast in 1951. Each year, the lectures bring to our campus an outstanding musicologist, composer, or music theorist who presents both formal and informal lectures that foster an increased appreciation of music as an academic discipline. We regret that this evening the members of the Springfield family are unable to attend. But in their absence, let me tell you a little bit about this remarkable series. The Springfield Music Lectures at Rhodes College began auspiciously in 1991 with Mozart expert Jane Perry-Camp, and most recently featured acclaimed composers Jennifer Higdon and Pamela Zeed. The other luminaries in the series have included David Huron, Paul Hillier, Morton Lawrenson, John Rudder, Sir David Wilcox, Christopher Hogwood, Jason Robert Brown, Ted Gioia, Libby Larson, that's just a few. We are delighted that tonight's speaker, Dr. Richard Taruskin, is the 2019 Springfield Music Lecturer. Born in New York, Dr. Taruskin studied Russian at Columbia University as an undergraduate, then went on to earn a PhD there in musicology, and subsequently joined the faculty at Columbia. In the 1980s, he began writing for the New York Times and in other newspapers and academic journals, and his provocative assertions about music quickly became highly influential in the classical music world. He joined the faculty at the University of California, Berkeley in 1986. Dr. Taruskin has made an enormous mark in the music world through his Russian music research. His books on Russian opera, Mussorgsky, and Stravinsky, for example, not only reshaped our image of the original composers, but also updated the methodology of musicology research itself. His 6-volume Oxford History of Western Music in 2005 represents a literary landmark in musicology and is perhaps the largest overview of music history ever written by a single author. This was my favorite quote. Toronto's Globe and Mail enthused in its review of the book. This is a feast of contrarian ideas with enough spice to sting the palate of anyone with a stake in telling the old stories in the old way. It aims for nothing less than the reevaluation of practically everything you thought you knew about classical music. It's a must-read. It's only 6 volumes. Pick up your copy. Dr. Taruskin is also the recipient of a number of prestigious international honors and prizes, which, because I actually want to hear him speak, I'm not going to list for you tonight. But he did win the Kyoto Prize in Arts and Philosophy in 2017, and when he did, the foundation said of him, Dr. Taruskin's critical practices and deep academic insights have changed music as we know it. The quality and volume of his work reveal that in music, creativity can be found not only in composition and performance, but also in meticulous discourse contextualizing this art. Dr. Taruskin's original scholarship, witty writing, and his career commitment to ousting lazy thinking is a light to those of us who study and practice in the area of musicology. We are so thrilled that he is here on campus working with our students. Please join me in welcoming the distinguished musicologist and historian Richard Taruskin as he tells us about the many dangers of music.
Thank you, Vanessa. That was really lovely to hear. And I'm really delighted to be here in Memphis and address you tonight with a paper, The Many Dangers of Music, which has a subtitle. So it's The Many Dangers of Music or Music Moves. Yes, now I have your interest. And I thought I'd begin by telling you how I know that God exists and that He watches over me. Now I'm sure I have your interest. It's because whenever I'm thinking deeply or obsessively about some topic or question, usually in preparation for an event like this one, God sends me clippings. Things turn up in my reading or in my mail or my email, even in the news or in conversation or in some other kind of everyday experience that assist my thinking or even answer my questions. Doubtless you may be rationalizing this. Perhaps you're thinking I'm just reacting to my surroundings and experiences with heightened alertness. No doubt that's true, but there always seem to be coincidences that go beyond that explanation. Serendipities that simply come to me from God knows where. And if God knows where, perhaps he's the one sending me. Like the one that arrived in the New York Times while I was just getting started on writing this text. The article by Michael Cooper, the Times' classical music reporter, had for a headline, "It's official, many orchestras are now charities." And it documented a decisive shift in the balance from ticket sales to subsidies from individual donors in the budgets of American symphony orchestras. So what you may be thinking? Classical music has always depended on patronage. In fact, that's one of the definitions of classical music. But since the early 19th century, patronage has been predominantly collective. We all buy tickets, and that supports the concert, rather than individual, the way it was, let's say, in Haydn's day. The fact that for the first time since the 19th century, audience support no longer accounts for the lion's share of the revenue for public musical performances is, to many of us, a grave portent. As Cooper writes, a portent of what may happen as classical music's footprint in the broader culture shrinks. And when I do this, it means I'm quoting, okay? Doesn't mean I'm haranguing you or admonishing you. It just means they aren't my words. So, a shrinking footprint in the culture. I don't want to take that line down. And my way of fighting it is to stir up trouble. Public debate is good for the arts, especially good for the high arts, which, if left too much alone, can easily lapse into moral indifference and social irrelevance. We prefer to say autonomy, but that's really what it means. So we need gadflies, we need contrarians, and if no one else is signing up, I guess I will volunteer. One should be willing to defend one's positions, lest one fall into complacency, which is just a fancy Latinate way of saying taking it lying down. Not to recognize that danger is to put music in danger. And God seems to agree, or else why would he be sending me so many clippings? The first piece of mine that elicited wide public notice beyond the music profession was an essay that I published in 1989 in the New Republic. I had written it during the fall of 1987 for the program book of the San Francisco Opera, which was putting on a production of Shostakovich's opera, The Lady Macbeth of the Vincennes District. I was then newly arrived in the Bay Area, having lived the first 42 years of my life in New York. During my first week on the Berkeley faculty, my office phone rang repeatedly with requests for contributions, both written and oral, for the local opera and symphony organizations. And that was one of the things that most convincingly reassured me that I had made an advantageous move by going to Berkeley. When I lived in New York and worked at Columbia University, I never heard from the New York Philharmonic or the Metropolitan Opera, let's say, would you like to come give a lecture or write a program essay? But I heard from all of these organizations in my first week on the Berkeley faculty. And I was very happy to accept the invitation. I craved a public voice, possibly because I'd given up a career as a performer when I moved to California. And so I gave in to their entreaties, and I accepted the opera's dual invitation to write a program essay and also provide a round of preview lectures for their opera guild. I had no idea that this gig would lead me so far beyond opera and music into the wider world, but then I started doing my homework. I made a close comparison between Shostakovich's opera and its literary source, which is a novella of the same name, The Lady Macbeth of the Vincennes District, by an author named Nikolai Leskov. This Lady Macbeth was a monstrous serial killer, but Shostakovich had sought through his music to create sympathy for her and justify her murderous deeds. He did this in various ways, but mainly he used his gifts of musical characterization to manipulate the audience's attitude. The title character's music is beautifully romantic and humanizing. All the other characters, and in particular her many victims, are all set out in ugly, lifeless style. It's really an amazing musical achievement, if you know this opera. And it served what seemed to me not only a morally dubious, dehumanizing purpose, but one that was all too closely analogous to the rationalizations that were given in Stalin's Russia for the suspension of what they called bourgeois morality in the name of the class struggle. I had not expected to come to this conclusion. It surprised and dismayed me as much as my eventual essay surprised and dismayed many readers. Because Shostakovich's opera is famous in the history of 20th century music for having been condemned and banned in what now appears to be the signal act of Soviet arts censorship. Its fate had cast Shostakovich as a victim, and victimhood, of course, implies innocence. Shostakovich's status as an innocent had, about a decade earlier, in the late 1970s, received an enormous boost with the publication of a book called Testimony, some of you may remember, which bore a subtitle identifying it as the memoirs of Dmitri Shostakovich, as related to and edited by Solomon Volkov. You may recall that the book's first-person narrative presented Shostakovich as an embittered dissident, resentful after a lifetime of mistreatment by the Soviet regime. And here I was writing of the work that marked his first collision with that Soviet regime. And I wrote this: so ineluctably has the opera come to symbolize pertinacity in the face of despotism that it is almost impossible to see it clearly now as an embodiment of that very despotism. Well, I'm very happy to say that the San Francisco Opera went ahead and printed those words in their program book. Their program editor in those days was a very savvy Croatian woman named Koralka Lockhart. Lockhart, obviously her married name. And she joked to me that the people who will read my essay will already have bought their tickets, so go ahead. I had by then written exactly once for the New Republic when Simon Karlinski, who was a Slavist of the Berkeley faculty, passed along to me a book that he had been asked to review, but the book was based on a dissertation that he had sponsored, so he had a conflict of interest. I got to review the book, and it was noticed by Leon Wieseltier, who was the literary editor of that magazine, who wrote me a nice note inviting me to submit more work. So I sent them this piece about Lady Macbeth, and I added another paragraph to give it a more topical spin, since this was going into a general interest political magazine. The fatwa against Salman Rushdie over the satanic verses was in the news early in 1989 when my article ran. So I connected it to the matter that I was addressing this way. I wrote, in the liberal West, as we have been proudly reminded in recent weeks, we don't believe in banning works of art. If it's because we believe that they cannot threaten life and morals, then we are more vulnerable than we imagine to the dehumanizing message of this great opera. If it is because we believe that ethics has no bearing on aesthetics, then the process of dehumanization has already begun. If, for its inspired music and its dramatic power, the Lady Macbeth of the 10th District is to hold the stage today, it should be seen and heard with an awareness of history, with open eyes and ears, and with hearts on guard. I probably don't even have to tell you that the mail ran very heavily and very abusively against me, or that writer after writer compared me with the Ayatollah Khomeini and, of course, with Stalin. It didn't surprise me, even though the paragraph that I just quoted to you, I think, plainly opposed censorship. But I've already noticed many times that artists and art lovers in the West had a hard time distinguishing between criticism and censorship. They even had a hard time understanding the meaning of the word if. What surprised me was my reaction to their reaction. I was exhilarated. What exhilarated me was not, or maybe I should say not just the chance to achieve notoriety, but the fact that I had elicited an excited reaction from a non-professional audience with a serious discussion of a serious work of art. And that, I'm sorry to say, had become a rarity. The isolation of serious art from the sphere of the public, and especially political discourse, which, as I have tried to show, and which many others by now have also shown, was an artifact and a consequence of the Cold War in the West, that was killing off interest in serious art. If stirring political debate could revive interest in it and prolong its life in our distracted society, well, deal me in. So I've actually sought opportunities to pit ethics against aesthetics. Not because one of them is right and the other one is wrong, but precisely because both are right, both are genuine values, that often come into collision because they're independent variables. I think the position that I've espoused over the years has gained some ground since the end of the European Cold War, which knocked the strongest prop out from beneath the wishful old German romantic cliche that, quoting Schopenhauer now, the history of art and philosophy is guiltless and unstained by blood. Nicht blutbefleckt, unstained by blood. But even now, I'm brought up short on occasion by renewed resistance, sometimes quite unexpected. And I don't at all take it for granted that you, my present audience, are necessarily agreeing with me as I speak. My most recent reminder was the clipping from God that furnished me with my gambit tonight, the way I started tonight. While writing this piece, I was in negotiations with the Bavarian State Opera, which was putting on a new production of Lady Macbeth by Harry Kupfer. He was a veteran, formerly East German opera director. The program editor from Munich wrote me for permission to reprint my old San Francisco essay, specifically in the form it took when it was published by the New Republic. They wanted it in that form precisely because of the opening that I rewrote for the New Republic, in which I summed up the case against the authenticity of Volkov's book Testimony, that purported book of Shostakovich's memoirs. The book, I'm happy to say, has been largely discredited by now, at least in the United States. Not primarily through my efforts, but largely through the efforts of another musicologist who works on Soviet music named Laurel Fay. So no one in this country, certainly no serious writer or scholar, would quote from that book without serious qualification. But I was informed by my Munich editor that in Germany the book still has currency. So they particularly wanted to reprint what he called the great Volkov part of my essay, especially since the conductor of their production, Kirill Petrenko, coming from Russia himself, has always had his doubts about Volkov. So far, so good. But then my Munich correspondent went on, there's one big question though. Your take on the opera is quite harsh. I've been discussing this with my colleagues intensively, and while we all agree that your perspective is as original as it has its merits, and is certainly worth hearing for a larger audience, I, for one, that is, my editor, for one, was thrilled to read a dissenting opinion at last. It sort of differs from our stage director's interpretation of the opera. Naturally, not really a problem, but for us as an opera house, it's still rather a stretch to say in print that we are playing an opera that endorses mass murder. Well, that wasn't quite what I had said. I won't get into that. And that's because the man from Munich wasn't really disagreeing with me. He was just voicing qualms about the impression my essay would make on the audience to whom he had to sell the opera. I've heard this sort of thing so often I hear, well, what Taruskin says may be true, but I just wish he wouldn't say it. And it made me even more grateful in long retrospect to Corey Lockhart for her jovial assurances, on printing my essay in San Francisco. You might be thinking that this example only illustrates the difference between scholarly and commercial pursuits, these scholars being the virtuously disinterested ones. I'll show you, though, that I had met with very similar and at times even more intransigent resistance from my own corner. The Munich editor, evidently a very perceptive and subtle man, didn't ask me to suppress my opinion. He only asked that I add one last paragraph that discusses the value of a performance of this piece today. Why is it important to keep it on stage and ask ourselves the questions it poses? It seems to me that you do think this opera, as horrifying as it is, still has some greatness to it. Well, indeed I do. And that's precisely why the ethical issues are worth discussing. Mounting a potent ethical challenge to what I see as destructive complacency about aesthetics requires that it be directed at objects that have unquestioned or even unquestionable aesthetic value. If you denounce blackface minstrelsy or the caricaturing of religious or ethnic minorities, for example, in Tin Pen Alley songs from the 1920s, and there are endless articles that do that sort of thing in our literature by now, they don't raise anybody's temperature because no one's cultural capital is invested in such repertoires. The very famous musicologist Susan McClare, who I bet you many of you have heard of, her stroke of genius was to aim her feminist strictures at a piece nobody could be neutral about, Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, the icon of all classical music icons. Nobody could be immune to that onslaught unless you were a misogynist and proud of it. Your aesthetic and your ethical commitments were placed in conflict. To attempt a refutation of what McClary said meant arguing on her ground, which is why most of those who engaged with her didn't actually try to deny that the first movement of the symphony contained what she called one of the most horrifyingly violent episodes in the history of music, let alone the murderous rage of a rapist, as she called it in the first version of the piece. She actually toned that down later, but nevertheless, it gets quoted a lot. And it isn't quoted to refute it, it is merely denounced. So to denounce an assertion is not to refute it, it's simply to avoid discussion. Nobody objected when Donald Francis Toby, another very famous commentator on Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, called the same spot. It's the beginning of the recapitulation in the first movement where the timpani is going great guns for about 60 measures. It's probably the loudest and longest drum roll, I think, in the whole literature. Toby called it "The Heavens on Fire," Nobody objected. Everybody recognized that was just a metaphor. Well, guess what? McClary's murderous rage of a rapist was also a metaphor. That's all we've got when we talk about music. Scott Burnham, yet another commentator on Beethoven's Ninth, there have been thousands of such commentators, gracefully, if tacitly, acknowledged McClary's version when he wrote of the sense of sublime catastrophe in those bars of Beethoven's, sometimes heard as a forceful collision, sometimes as transgressive violence, always as supremely unsettling. Is there nothing to choose between the metaphors? Both of them will serve. Scott Burnham never meant to imply that, and I would certainly not imply that either one. Which metaphor we use or choose to use makes a huge difference. And I mean to redeem this moment with something bigger, much more basic about music and metaphor in conclusion later on. In my most recent email to the Munich program editor, I gave him leave to write the requested paragraph himself, since I can't write it well enough in German, prescribing that it distinguish carefully between description, critique, and censorship. Putting our hearts on guard, that was the metaphor I used, how we should listen to Shostakovich's opera. Putting our hearts on guard means recognizing that there is a difference between arguing for mitigation of a crime, the way any decent defense attorney would do, and regarding a crime as virtuous, as totalitarian legal systems often do. The music associated with the title character in Shostakovich's opera does very powerfully signify moral worthiness and even innocence. The part about hearts on guard I wrote to my Munich correspondent is a comment on the unique persuasive powers that music, especially operatic music, has always exerted on listeners. Music makes great propaganda, and I think we all will agree about that, yes? So believing that, and also believing that it is an important aspect of teaching music within a humanistic curriculum to raise ethical as well as aesthetic issues, and to raise them with respect to art that we value. I've made it a habit of trying always to incite within my own students collisions between their aesthetic and their ethical commitments. In the classroom, my favorite vehicles have been oratorios by Bach and Handel. The Bach example, as you might well guess, is the St. John Passion, which, following its biblical source, the Gospel of St. John, named the Juden, the Jews, as the crowd calling for the death of Christ, rather than das Volk, the people, the way the St. Matthew Passion text does, because the book of Matthew says the people, it's the book of John that says the Jews. I began using it as an instrument for raising ethical issues as a result of an incident that took place early in my teaching career. Before I had ever thought to depart from the attitudes that I had been trained to have about the moral worthiness of all great art. My earlier habit had been to present the two passions by Bach side by side, representing the St. Matthew Passion by its monumental and essentially pictorial opening chorus, and characterizing the whole Passion through it as a contemplative work, and presenting the St. John Passion with intense exchange and recitative, including choral recitative, what they call turba choruses, between Pontius Pilate and the crowd, who will not allow him to let Jesus off, characterizing the whole Passion through that passage as a more dramatic, quasi-operatic work. It was a student who was made uncomfortable by the characterization of the crowd as Jews who queried the appropriateness of using that particular part of the St. John Passion as illustration. Another student then said, but the Jews, after all, were responsible for the death of Christ. I asked him in preparation for the discussion that I saw we would have to have, how he knew that. From Bach, was his answer. And I confess, yes, it was shocking. It shocked me. Because for the first time, I was actually seeing that a great work of art had done somebody harm. So that became the topic of the day. The strategy that I adopted from then on, which is now reflected also in the Oxford History of Western Music, is to present the two passions side by side, hoping that nobody will notice the Jews first time around, so that later I can come back and confront the class with the matter and ask them, given that no reputable historian today blames the Jews for the death of the historical Jesus, and even the Catholic Church got around to absolving the Jews in 1964. So given that, I asked my class whether it is objectionable to perform a text that incorporates a Bible that has led to bloody persecutions. There are many possible answers to that question, and I'm not necessarily endorsing any of them in this discussion. It's not the answers, but the question that I consider important, that is important for a teacher to raise. And I insist that the question be properly framed. Not whether St. John was right or wrong about the Jews, not whether J.S. Bach was personally anti-Semitic, because there'll always be people who want to defend him against what they perceive as that charge, or whether exposure to the work can affect belief, since I have empirical evidence to report that it can and has done that in the case of my student. The question doesn't involve Bach and the congregation of religious believers that he served with his art. The question involves the people who perform the work today, us, and particularly those who perform the work under secular auspices before religiously and ethnically mixed audiences. What are their ethical responsibilities? Do they have ethical responsibilities? If so, to whom? Bach is long dead, I wrote in the Oxford History, but the St. John Passion lives on. Jews not only hear it nowadays, they often participate in performances of it, and are sometimes shocked to learn what it is that they're singing. And here I was thinking of an incident that took place at Swarthmore College, which brought Professor Michael Marisson into the discussion. He's a Bach scholar who teaches at Swarthmore. And it eventually resulted in the publication of his wonderful book called Lutheranism, Anti-Judaism, and Bach's St. John Passion, which I enthusiastically recommend to you. So back to my text in the Oxford History. Are they wrong? That is, those who feel uncomfortable or those who object? At Swarthmore, the Jewish students who were asked to perform the work for a while were refusing to do it. That's why they called Michael Marisson in to persuade them. So are they wrong? Does Bach's music redeem the text? Would it impair Bach's work from the standpoint of its present social use if the text were amended to exclude the bloodline? There have been performances that have substituted other words for die, such as die Leute, which has the same number of syllables and simply means the people. And if people disagree about the answers to these difficult questions, on what basis can they be adjudicated? It is no part of the purpose of this book, that is the Oxford History from which I'm quoting, it is no part of the purpose of this book to provide the answers to these questions, but it is integral to its purpose to raise them. Do you agree? Not everybody does. The Oxford History's most distinguished reviewer, Charles Rosen, objected vociferously to my raising these questions. Here's a quotation from his review. Taruskin asks if we have the right to listen to the chorus in Bach's St. John Passion, where the Jews demand the death of Jesus. He hastens to say that he's only posing the question, not giving an answer. But some questions are too foolish to be asked. Actually, I agree with Rosen about that. That question is indeed too foolish to be asked, but it wasn't my question. To deflect the question onto the matter of rights, do we have the right to listen to it? I didn't say that, because to deflect the question this way makes things very easy for the reviewer by yet again stigmatizing ethical concerns as censorship, which enabled Rosen to admonish me that the proposal to censor the art of the past to hide unpleasant aspects of history puts Taruskin with one foot in the camp of those who would ban Huckleberry Finn from the shelves of our school libraries. But I hope it's evident to you that I actually stand with both feet in the camp of those who insist on devoting time in the classroom to examining Huckleberry Finn, precisely and explicitly in an effort to understand unpleasant aspects of history. As a way of strengthening our ability to view our beliefs and the beliefs of our ancestors freely and critically. That, after all, is the purpose of education and also the purpose of scholarship, at least as I define them. But perhaps more debatably, I also contend that a promise not to censor implies a promise to critique. And I've been acting on that contention. The specific purpose to which the passage from the Oxford History that I read you concerning the St. John Passion was addressed was that of exposing rhetorical strategies, both in the historiography of art and its writing about the history of art, and in the works of art themselves that are the subject of historiography, and the harm that both of them can do, that is, both the works and the historiography. I think it's remarkable that my calling attention to this potentiality, that is, this potentiality of artworks and the potentiality of art historians and art history to do harm. I think it's remarkable that my calling attention to it has made me a controversial figure on today's musical intellectual scene. People have been writing about the dangers of art since Plato, at least. There's no music history text or anthology of source readings that does not include the passages from the Republic on the dangers of music, my very title. The ethical thread runs through the whole history of music and philosophy, from St. Augustine and any number of other church fathers to Vincenzo Galilei and any number of other Florentine humanists, all the way to Wagner, to Nietzsche, to Tolstoy, and into the 20th century when people began to laugh at it. Here's a story we've all snickered at, I'm sure, which was already old in the time of the philosopher Boethius, who wrote in the 6th century CE, the 6th century after Christ, who asked, is there anyone, this is Boethius now, is there anyone who does not know the tale about the young man from Therein, who, drunk and excited by the sound of the Hyperphrygian mode, was calmed by Pythagoras, who brought him back to his senses by changing the music to a spondee? Whereas a prostitute had been locked up in the house of a rival, and whereas he, in a frenzy, wanted to burn the place down, Pythagoras, who was watching the night sky, as usual, and observing the course of the stars, having realized that excited as he was by the Phrygian mode, he would refuse, despite the many warnings of his friends to change his mind, advised that the mode be changed, thus tempering the frenzy in the young man's soul and restoring him to a peaceful state of mind. I once heard a wonderful old medievalist musicologist named Luther Dittmer get a very easy laugh by telling a version of that story and then adding tunings on request. From then on, I would get the same laugh myself by repeating it in my class, but that's how academic humor works, right? But that's a nervous laugh. Even if this version of musical ethos, that is the influence of music on behavior, even if this version of musical ethos is hyperbolic, the way parables are always hyperbolic, right? We all know that the phenomenon it dramatizes is real. It's not that musical ethos has been refuted and we no longer believe in it. Rather, musical ethos has been exorcised and we no longer assent to it when we are talking, that is, about classical music. In other musical contexts, discussion of musical ethos is allowed. The translation from Boethius that I just read to you comes from the American edition of a very serious study by Gilbert Rouget, a French ethnomusicologist, called Music and Trance, a book that mainly discusses contemporary African music. In the study of cult music, ethos is tolerated. And another area in which American ethnomusicologists and sociologists enthusiastically study musical ethos is in the context of political and social activism. Have you ever wondered why it's allowed to talk about musical ethos in those contexts, but not when you're talking about classical music? I mean, I think we can begin to understand the taboo on the matter of musical ethics in the name of pure aesthetics, against which I have been working, by calling attention to the dangers of high art music. For a pithy endorsement of the taboo on raising this question, I call predictably upon Igor Stravinsky, the most usual suspect in this connection, who made the insulation of art one of his life's missions. And musicians can all probably quote some of his famous pronouncements about the detachment of music from all social concerns by art. But here is one that you may not have heard. In one of the very last of his so-called conversations with his ghostwriter, Robert Crabb, Stravinsky went on a counteroffensive against the charge of aestheticism, which he defined ad hoc as the self-sufficiency, or as it may be, the selfishness of an artist who refuses to come out and play. He, of course, rejects this charge, suggesting that it originates in his lack of sympathy with the use of music as an advertisement for extra musical causes. Even the greatest symphony, as I see it, being able to do very little about Hiroshima. Indeed, the greater the symphony this seems to imply, the less it can do, and the less it should do. For one of the things this statement seeks to accomplish, such Stravinsky's statement seeks to accomplish, is the differentiation of high art music from lower, more ephemeral types, and in the words of a conference announcement I once received as a clipping from God, reflect and respond to evolving political climates. That is, popular music does that, but not classical. Love it or hate it, high art creates social divisions more than it creates social solidarity. In the first place, the division between those who appreciate high art and those who don't. And the ones who appreciate often despise the ones who don't. And that's the most basic sort of social division. Stravinsky's opinion about the inability of music to do any social good in the world could be interpreted as a justification of moral indifference, the debased precinct to which aesthetic autonomy, too zealously defended, will inevitably descend, or it might be seen in a better light as a defense against the subversion or distortion of artworks in the interests of propaganda. In that sense, classical music has been literally a safe space for artists and their audiences. Literally, yes, but I would insist not actually. It's because I don't believe that the space we have created for it is truly safe, and because I do believe that our repression of ethics from the discourse of classical music has indeed harmed it. that I had become so interested in exposing and accounting for this taboo and bringing its premises, both witting and unwitting, to light, in hopes ultimately of bringing it down. You may be getting ready to tell me, as I have often been told, that I am beating a dead horse, but I have proof that the horse is still kicking. God sent me the relevant clipping when I dropped in at the UC Berkeley Music Department, where I only go sporadically now that I'm an emeritus prof. And I found the latest music textbook catalog from Oxford University Press, containing a full description of a music appreciation text by a professor whose name is R. Larry Todd. Some of you probably know. He teaches in North Carolina at Duke University, which is advertised as adoptable when I found this circular for the spring of 2017. So I found this in advance of publication. That's the important point. But the book was imminent and already being advertised. It's billed, of course, this textbook as innovative because all textbooks are marketed as innovative. But its actual innovations, as is often the case with textbooks, are in matters of technology, not content. One of its format features in this particular textbook is a paragraph called Why Listen that comes at the beginning of each chapter. Here's the one telling us why we should listen to romantic music. Somewhere in the second half of the 18th century, the status of music began to rise among the arts. Until then, music had often been regarded as a diversion because of its association with subjective emotional experiences. But with the transformation brought on by the Romantic movement, including its new interest in subjectivity, music acquired new allure and prestige. By the late 19th century, music's position among the arts had changed considerably. The influential English critic Walter Pater captured music's new importance when he wrote that all art constantly aspires toward the condition of music. That's another phrase I'm sure a lot of us could have recited in unison by heart. Now, I know it's very unfair to my old friend Larry to appear to single him out, because he's only doing what we have all been doing for a very long time. But by quoting from a forthcoming commercial text, forthcoming meaning it is not yet but soon to be published, I can show irrefutably that we're still doing it. Because here's a book that isn't even out yet that is still doing it. So this is still the current discourse. And what we're doing when we quote Walter Pater in this connection is removing music as an art, or insofar as it is an art, that is classical music, from the wider world. The condition of music did have to do with subjective emotional experiences, as Larry Todd writes, but only with emotional experiences engendered by the music. It was not a mimetic theory, that is, music doesn't imitate nature, let alone an ethical theory, this view of art that he's attributing to Walter Pater. And only in the mildest, most decorous way was it what you call an arousal theory, that is, music makes you feel emotion. Because it placed the highest aesthetic value on form, and that means, by extension, on the artist's technique, thus prefiguring all those approaches to art that I have tried to characterize and impugn as embodying what I call the poetic fallacy. Poetic for the word for making. It's a view of art that only talks about the making of the object. And I believe it is a fallacy, and we still teach it. While in all other kinds of art, it is possible to distinguish the matter from the form, and the understanding can always make this distinction, yet it is the constant effort of art to obliterate it. That is what Pater wrote to explain his famous dictum, that all of art aspires to the state of music. Now, why do I regard this as a fallacy? Pater stipulated that the mere matter of a poem, that is, the paraphrasable content of a poem, for instance, its subject, namely its given incidents or situation, or the mere matter of a picture, that is, what is a picture of, the actual circumstances of an event, the actual topography of a landscape, they are nothing without the form, the spirit of the handling. And so far I agree, and I'm sure you agree, anybody would agree with that up to that point. But then Pater goes on to write, this form, this mode of handling should become an end in itself. And further, that this is what all art constantly strives after and achieves in different degrees, with music, which does not have any natural or necessary natural model, out in front, the most abstract of the arts, thus providing the other arts with an object for emulation. Ultimately, form must banish content from our minds, is the implication of Pater's theory of art. All that should matter to us in this view is the quality of the maker's input. That is a fallacy because it excludes the matching viewpoint of the apprehender, the person who is hearing the music, the person who is looking at the picture, reading the story, who of course notices all the things that Pater stigmatizes with the word mere, the matter, the subject, the incidents, the situation, the topography, and reacts to them, despite being instructed to ignore them. The danger of music lies in the perception, not the making of it. And to ignore the perceptual aspects, even as one affects to be training listeners, as you do in music appreciation, we're always telling our students we're teaching them how to listen to music, and at the same time we're teaching them not only what to listen for, but also what to ignore. Well, this, it seems to me, is an act of evasion that lowers rather than raises consciousness. Hence, it lowers defenses. And of course, composers know that very well. As Larry Todd's appropriation of Pater shows, music appreciation received its mandate from the Victorians. Pater lived in the age of Queen Victoria. And the chief aesthetician of that period was a man named Matthew Arnold, as you probably know. In this country, it was the viewpoint promoted by the old guard of newspaper critics, beginning with John Sullivan Dwight in Boston, and proceeding through Henry Craybill, Henry Fink, W.J. Henderson, and Olden Downs. These were the critics who posited a priori that the effect, hence the purpose of art, although they never would have used the word purpose, we'll get to that in a moment, that the effect and purpose of art was moral uplift, and the higher the art, the higher it lifted you up. That there could be any moral danger in such an enterprise was unthinkable, not even to be suggested. But that's already a danger. It's a twofold danger. Teaching people that love of art ennobles them teaches them nothing but self-regard. You're left wondering, with George Steiner, how to explain those who sing Schubert in the evening and torture in the morning. I'm going to the end of my life haunted more and more by the question, why did the humanities not humanize? Of course, he is invoking the Nazis there, who loved their Schubert, and I think understood Schubert as well as we do. Yeah, he says, I don't have an answer. You ever hear anything so sad? But that's because I think he was posing the wrong question. Where did the question go wrong? I blame Immanuel Kant. Right back at the beginning of what we call aesthetics, that change in the status of the arts to which Larry Todd brought attention in his new textbook. Kant, with his insistence on disinterestedness, of course, disinterestedness is not uninterestedness. Disinterested means without a stake, without partiality. Doesn't mean you're not interested. So his insistence on disinterestedness in our evaluation of art, and in its making as well, insofar as the artist should demonstrate no purpose beyond the purpose of making the art. What Kant called Zweckmäßigkeit ohne Zweck, which is usually translated as purposiveness without purpose. You'd think that with that criterion in mind of disinterestedness and purposelessness, Kant would place music at the top of the artistic heap, the way Walter Pater did, but no. Kant put it at the bottom, precisely because music does not convey propositions, as he put it. You know, or as I like to say to my students, you can't use music to order a hamburger. So while music was the highest among those arts that are valued for their pleasantness, nevertheless, Kant wrote, if we estimate the worth of the beautiful arts by the culture they supply to the mind, music will have the lowest place because it merely plays with sensations. Like so many literary persons, Kant thought music was just pretty tinkling. Or to use his own analogy, music was like a sonic perfume, a purely sensuous phenomenon. And the only danger music could pose, accordingly, was the same as the danger posed by perfume, that of unwelcome diffusion. You know, if you're sitting in a railroad car with somebody who's wearing perfume and you're allergic, you're out of luck. And if, as Kant says in one of his books, if you're trying to write some philosophy, such as I'm trying to do, and your neighbors are singing their prayers, you just can't concentrate. So let's face it, like another otherwise admirable person, Vladimir Nabokov, Kant was militantly tone deaf. And at least one of his contemporaries knew it, and he called him out on it. This is the clipping from God, which, although I'm presenting it in conclusion, was the one that started this whole talk on its way, when I received from the University of California Press a book for blurbing, you know, for writing a nice sentence so they could put it on the back. It was Philip B. Bowman's brilliantly annotated edition of the musical writings of Johann Gottfried Herder. Now, I, of course, knew who Herder was as the philosopher, and I knew him as the philosopher whose study of Baltic folk songs had laid the foundation for romantic nationalism. Indeed, you know, the word folk song was invented by Herder. And I knew his theories about music and language, but what Bowman's edition first brought to my attention was Caligone, one of Herder's latest works, written in 1800, the last year of the 18th century. Herder never names Kant, but he paraphrases him so closely that we're left in no doubt as to whose recent writings on music Herder found to be contrary to all experience. How can you prefer the visible to the audible, Herder wanted to know. Here, of course, he's paraphrasing another unnamed but easily recognized predecessor, Gotthold Ephraim Lessing, and his Laocoon, a book that I too have often prescribed to the perplexed. Lessing did not venture to choose between the arts of time, which are audible, and the arts of space, which are visible. But for Herder, music surpasses the arts of the visible, hands down. It must surpass them, he wrote. Just as spirit surpasses the body, for music is spirit, related to the power of the innermost strength, that of movement. Music derives its power from its invisible movement, in Herder's view, through which it speaks to us, moving us with true impact. And we ourselves, does anyone know how, sense this impact without opposition, but with real power. And now a truly remarkable passage, which will remind anyone who knows them of famous discussions of music by Arthur Schopenhauer, Edward Hanslick, Susanna Langer, Roger Sessions, and several of our own contemporaries. Herder wrote, "Every moment is temporary for this this art, that is for music. And so it must be, for it is precisely the ways in which it is shorter and longer, stronger and weaker, more and less, that produces its meaning, its impression. In its arrival and departure, in its becoming and being, therein lies the conquering strength of sound and its perception. In the ways this or that tone combines with others, in the ways tones rise and fall, disappear or raise and renew themselves on the strings stretched by harmony toward eternal, insoluble laws, therein lies my soul, my courage, my love and hope. You effervescent spirits of the air, come with gentle tones and flee, move my heart and release me to an eternal longing, through you and to you. I think that's just beautiful. But besides being beautiful, I think it's also correct. And of course, this is also a metaphor, but not just another metaphor, this idea of music moving. This one, despite Herder's disclaimer, really explains something. It's the earliest attempt, I know, to try actually to account for the effects of music as described by Plato in that passage that always comes first among our source readings. I'll quote the translation that Oliver Strunk chose to open his classic anthology, Source Readings in Music History, from which everybody from my generation first studied the history of musical thinking. So here's the translation, actually it's by Benjamin Jowett, quoted from Strunk. So Plato wrote, "Education in music is most sovereign, because more than anything else, rhythm and harmony find their way to the inmost soul and take strongest hold upon it, bringing with them and imparting grace if one is rightly trained, and otherwise the contrary." And Herder's idea resonates equally well with one of the latest such avowals by Roger Sessions in a book called Questions About Music, who wrote that what music conveys to us is the nature of our existence as embodied in the movement that constitutes our innermost life. Now, these avowals of the powers of music are at the same time warnings of the dangers of music. Edward Hanslick, so often and so wrongly dismissed as a formalist, who seems to have read his Herder, had the wit to observe that the concept of motion has up to now been conspicuously neglected in investigations of the nature and effects of music. But it seems to us the most important and crucial concept, and he ensconced the notion of musical motion in his famously inscrutable and untranslatable slogan that music consists, I'll say it first in German, consists of tönen bewegte Form. I don't know how to translate that into English. I've seen sound enlivened form, I've seen form animated by sound, tönen bewegte Form. But the word I want to emphasize here is bewegte. He then devoted the rest of his book to a zealous effort to contain the force of this motion, Bewegung. He frankly acknowledged the danger. The other arts persuade, Hanslick wrote, but music invades us. As you may have noticed, Herder's motion metaphor is actually a double metaphor, or maybe it's a pun, playing on the transitive and intransitive meanings of the verb to move. Music moves, Herder is showing us how, and because it moves us. But as Herder also knew, there is an actual, tangible basis for the metaphor, or rather the many metaphors of musical motion in the physics of sound production. So the levels of motion in music, actual and virtual, are at least three. This is Herder again. Do not all bodies emit a sound when they are struck and made to reproduce themselves elastically? Is there not a medium that takes up this sound, carries it forth, and conveys it to other harmonious bodies? What is sound, therefore, but the voice of all agitated bodies, projected out from within, declaring softly or loudly to other harmonious beings their suffering, their resistance, their agitated energies? So there is the vibration or bewegung, the motion of the struck body. There is the bewegung of the air, the medium in which it takes place. And then there is more figurative bewegung that goes on inside of us. So music works through bewegung, which in this context I would like to translate as activation. Bodies are activated, their vibration activates the air, which activates our sense organs, which through a mental process involving metaphor activate our emotions and ultimately our behavior. Almost as if speaking across the centuries directly to Lydia Gurr, who wrote a wonderful book called The Imaginary Museum of Musical Works, and to the writer that she interpreted, and almost as if giving voice to my own critique of what I call the poetic fallacy, the only thing that you care about art is the making of it. Herder wrote that the product of all transitory arts is effects, not works. That works better in German. Wirkungen, nicht Werke. You see, Wirkung and Werk. It's the effect that we're interested in as philosophers or as listeners, not the making of the work. He takes this very far. So far as seemingly to deny that there can be such a thing as musical form. Listen to this. With regard to these sensations and even shapes that reach us through hearing, we cannot speak of the fixed outlines and forms presented by the eye. For in fact, the ear never configures in a fixed manner. Even if tones could constitute forms or parts of forms, they would all last only briefly. Each tone takes its form with it and buries it. Now here, I think Herder went too far. Because our minds can indeed store a series of impressions and constitute them as a shape in memory and thereafter in anticipation. And such abstracted shapes can be generalized and classified, and there's no harm in doing this as long as we remember that these shapes exist in us, in our imaginations, rather than in the music. This is how the metaphor of musical form must have started, and eventually it led to what's called the Form and Lehre, the prescriptive study of musical forms, which I think has done harm. Again, and as promised, we're dealing with a choice between two viable metaphors. But the primary effect of music, I hope you will agree, is more as Herder describes it than as Hansel did, when actively resisting the bewegung in his turned bewegte form. He compares music to an arabesque, which is visible and, as Lessing would insist, static. Although, an arabesque is a curving line, right? Although it must originate as a motion, the way you draw it, you have to move in a certain way. Your pen must follow a certain trajectory, or your pen holding hand. What proves the point about primacy for me is the memory of my first full-strength encounter with a man whose genius for musical invasions gave Hanslick the fright that produced his famously regressive, famously evasive theory. And of course, I'm talking about Richard Wagner. It was in 1959, when I was 13 going on 14. Friends of my parents, who had a subscription to the Metropolitan Opera, were going to a wedding and had to miss a matinee performance of Tristan and Isolde, starring Birgit Nilsson, whose recent Metropolitan debut had been in the role of Isolde and had been front page news. I remember seeing her on the front page and being so amazed that Music Review was on the front page. My parents, fortunately for me, were going to the same wedding. So the ticket holder's grandson and I were the ones who got the tickets. I was still pretty young for Wagner at full strength, and sitting through the entire opera, even in a box at the Old Met, lucky me, was an endurance contest. But the final aria, you know, Isolde's Verklärung, as Wagner called it, but as we all called the Liebestod, that hit me with a force I had never yet experienced when listening to music. And by then, I was already an avid and somewhat knowledgeable listener, maybe just an opinionated listener. It stayed with me for days, and it was, I think, precisely because I was not anticipating its effects of motion and assimilating them to notions of musical form, but rather allowed myself to be caught up in their unfolding in real time and shattered upon their arrival. And if you know the piece, you know what I'm talking about. It's because I was not thinking of it as form, but only as musical motion, that I was so bowled over, that it was such a strong impression. It was harmonic motion or progression. A metaphor, yes, but boy, it sure seems real. That it invaded me and showed me that such a thing was possible. I had never known such a thing. Harmonic motion is an especially tortuous metaphor, and one highly dependent on acculturation, so it could only affect me as it did because I was by then, as I say, an avid, and at least for my age, experienced listener. But it was the very metaphor that Wagner consciously invoked when he wrote of navigating the sea of harmony, as he put it. I had played Nilsson's recording of the Liebestod to my classes from the moment I became a college teacher. So for 40 years, I played that to classes, precisely to show them what music can do thanks to its motion metaphors, and hoping that it will have an effect on them like the one it had on me when I first heard it, although I knew it couldn't because I was getting it live from a living singer standing in front of me rather than on a record. But although I still appreciated its force on these subsequent hearings, even after 40 years, I still thought it was wonderful. I was far more consciously aware of how Wagner was achieving that miraculous vehicle, effect. I never felt it again as strongly as I did that first time, partly because it now was formed to me, something that existed in memory outside of actual elapsing time, that was now apprehended in anticipation and, of course, braced for. So there are two main music metaphors. There's movement, and there's form or structure. And, although we rarely recognize this, they are in contradiction. And if the contradiction is not noticed more often, it's because the metaphors themselves are so familiar as to have become naturalized. We often don't even think of them as metaphors, and this applies most especially to structure, which is often assumed to be an immanent property of music, its structure, even by today's professional philosophers. But if you look up the word structure in the dictionary, you'll see that it refers literally to space and only metaphorically to time. My trusty Dex Dictionary, the 1950 edition of the American College Dictionary, which has been on my desk a very, very long time, gives 7 meanings of the word structure. I'm going to ask you to take my word for it that they all refer to space, because otherwise I have to read you 7 dictionary definitions and put you to sleep. But here's the last of them. The last one of 7. The manner in which atoms in a molecule are joined to each other, especially in organic chemistry, where it is represented by a diagram of the molecular arrangement. Now, I chose to quote this one because, as anyone knows who's ever looked into a music textbook, whether of theory or of history or even of music appreciation, the structure, putting in quotes here, the structure of a musical composition is almost always represented didactically by an abstracted diagram, which is to say visually, which is to say in a form that substitutes space for time. Lessing would object, and so do I, And that, I suggest, is how classical music creates its safe space. Looking at the score, or at a diagram that represents the harmonic trajectory that so clobbered 14-year-old me in 1959, and has surely clobbered many of you when you heard it with fresh ears. Well, just looking at a diagram of the score, one can easily say, with Alice, the Queen of Hearts, why, you're just a pack of notes. So I hope it's obvious I'm not in any simple ideological way opposed to formal analysis, or to any of the other things that musicologists do. I also have talked about structure in the classroom. But I always have tried to keep it in perspective and to keep it real, to make sure my students know that at least I regard structure as a metaphor rather than as a property of music. My position may be reminding you a little, if you know it, of Carolyn Abate in her celebrated polemic called Music, Drastic or Gnostic, which is another plea to study Wirkung rather than Werke, to study effects rather than structures. But I reject her third sentence. I'm sure you'll remember her third sentence, right? Her third sentence is, shouldn't this be what we do? Which of course means, shouldn't this be what you do? In other words, shouldn't you do what I do? I reject that kind of authoritarian talk and all that follows from it. And if it were my article, I would have called it Music, Drastic and Gnostic, because both need attention, both the unfolding, that's the drastic, and the cognitive, that's the Gnostic, both need attention. We can go on studying Werke alongside Wirkung, that's okay with me. The thing is to get rid of taboos, not to exchange old ones for new ones. I don't know whether that will stop our orchestras from becoming charities, but if talk about music engages difficult, dangerous issues like the ones I have sought to raise, it may become more engaging, and perhaps more listeners will be engaged by the talk and then by the music. Thank you very much.
I think we have a little bit of time for questions, if anyone has a question or comment.
Or a vociferous objection, such as I am used to receiving. You'll make me feel professional.
Dr. Taruskin, thank you for coming to Memphis.
When very few, when we were talking during the discussion, right?
Yes. I'm David Sachs. It's very nice to meet you, sir. When does musical form become fine art? Is it when it faces the danger of historical obsolescence, such as the Bach fashion? Thank you.
Well, I find that question somewhat hard to answer because I don't know in what sense you're using the word form. Since I don't really regard musical form as real, as I've told you, so I can't really assess its relation to art, which I do regard as real. Musical form is something we abstract in memory and then store in anticipation, but I think it's terribly important to realize that it is something we do to an experience that does not take place in spatial, but in temporal relation to us. So, of course, it's high art music that usually gets parsed into its forms. So talking about music in formal terms is one of the ways of canonizing it. But I don't think music is becoming art when we do this. I think we are making music conform to a certain category that we have created. And the reason why we create the category of art for some music but not all music, it seems to me, is always somewhat invidious. And that's why I said that high art tends to create social division rather than social cohesion or social solidarity. That kind of distinction between the better and the worse in music, to me, that is a kind of metaphor too. It stands for the distinction between better and worse kinds of people, depending on what kind of music that they listen to. There's a wonderful book by a French sociologist named Pierre Bourdieu called Distinction, in which he studies musical preferences as badges of social status. And you know, after you read that book, you don't regard classical music the same as you did before. And if you're devoting your whole life to classical music, as of course I am, and as many of you are, you read Bourdieu, you feel kind of guilty. You feel kind of dirty. Because, well, it's not just music, it's all high art is a vehicle for snobbery. He shows it empirically, he shows it by just surveying people's questionnaires. But he's showing music is the art in which this is done most pervasively and most categorically. Musical tastes are a greater social status determinant than taste in any of the other art media. I wish he had speculated as to why this is, but I would guess it has something to do with the things I was talking about today, how music invades us and gets to our inner sense of our being more directly than the other arts do. So I know I've only talked around your question rather than answering it, but I think it's the best I can do.
Thank you so much for what you said tonight. It's been fascinating. I wrote down a question as I was listening. And I would genuinely, this isn't my chance to try to make a statement. I really want to know your thoughts on whether you believe this is true or if it's something you recognize in your experience over the years. As I was listening to you, what I sort of heard was that one of the dangers, perhaps, of music is its ability to subconsciously juxtapose beauty with the morally reprehensible. If that's a fair statement, which I'm not sure if it is, but it seems to me, contrary to the contemporary academic zeitgeist, which would decry beauty as trite and bourgeois, and would at the same time prefer to censor ideas by labeling them as products of a desirable power structure, rather than wrestle with ideas presented within the music itself.
Well, I don't know, that sounded like a statement to me. But
these
you
are
know,
statements that you perceive to be true
yes,
of the academic.
Certainly there are many who would agree with what you said. I won't inquire as to whether you're among them, but yeah, I understand that position. I would begin my answer by saying I question the whole notion of the last phrase you used, the music itself. What is the music itself? If you ever try to define the music itself, you'll find yourself only saying what it isn't, rather than what it is. And it is the great instrument of exclusion, the great instrument of distinction. And I would agree that music is often used in socially regressive ways. The talk of the music itself is usually an evasion of that very issue. So I once wrote a whole piece, a whole essay, trying to explode the notion that such a thing as the music itself is just the safe space we create to prevent us from looking at music in social or political connections, by saying that anything that we compare music to, or any content, to recall Walter Pater, any content that we find the music pertaining to is extra musical and therefore not part of the musical experience. And I think that is a silly thing to say. Take, for example, one of the earliest masterpieces of program music, the Symphonie Fantastique of Berlioz, which consists of music played by an orchestra, but also has a program, a verbal narrative that the music embodies in some way. And when Berlioz wrote the piece, he thought both of them were part of the symphony. He was often kind of shamed into repressing the program. Schumann wrote a review of the Symphony Fantastique. He said, oh, it's wonderful music, but who needs that program? But Berlioz wants us to know what the program is because he wants us to get a message from the music. And I think that music is a wonderful medium for conveying messages. That's one of the things I'm most committed to in what I've been saying tonight. And those messages will be either socially constructive or socially regressive, you know, and music can do both things. To characterize music as one or the other, I think is also a fallacy. Music can be a medium for all kinds of messages and expressions. I'm not sure whether I'm remembering your question well enough to know whether I've answered it, but would you like to follow up? Something that I haven't addressed?
No, I think that was excellent. I guess I'm struck by, and I actually do agree with you. I think that your idea that, I'm trying to remember how you said it, basically that refusing to censor requires us to examine.
Oh, yeah.
And I feel like that's not a very popular sentiment nowadays.
No, it is not. Yes, I have heard that. You'd be amazed at how angry I have managed to make people with expressing. I didn't expect to get much anger back from you because, you know, well, you're an intelligent group, right? But the readers of the New York Times were often very incensed to read these things. And often when I would talk to concert-going audiences who want to just go and enjoy the music, they don't want to be harangued about, you know, political issues. We go to music to get away from all that, yeah? Well, I always tell them, you know, if you think you're getting away from it, you're rendering yourself vulnerable to subliminal influences. You should always try to, well, you know, I sound a bit like Bertolt Brecht when I say this, but you know, you shouldn't give yourself up to the experience of art because that renders you passive, and if you're passive, you're too easily influenced and manipulated. And I try to give examples of how music does consciously, that is, the composer is the one with the consciousness, but the music is being written in such a way as deliberately to manipulate us. And the more we're aware of that, people always say, if we're aware of such things, we'll enjoy the music less. I think, no, you'll enjoy it more. I don't think that intellectual engagement is inimical to enjoyment. Or maybe it's just because, you know, I'm a professional scholar that I think intellectual engagement is enjoyable. But you know, if you can get your students interested in your lecture, you are in a sense, without explicitly exhorting them, you're persuading them that intellectual engagement can be enjoyable. So, you know, music should, I think, should not be regarded the way Kant regarded it, as simply a pleasure that is unattached to cognitive thought.
Hi, Jeremy Orris. I teach music theory down the road at the University of Memphis. It so happens I'm teaching 2 classes right now about musical form, and I was intrigued by a lot of what you said, because what I do on day 1 is I ask them, what is form? And I get this really awkward silence. Everyone's looking around, well, we're here to learn about form, why don't you tell us? But no one can ever give me a good definition. And we all understand that that's metaphorical, and that's something that's really hard to apply. So you mentioned earlier that, and I largely agree with what you said about form, about it being sort of artificial and doesn't really exist. Do you see a distinction between likening musical form to that of the plastic arts, say, a architectural understanding, as though there are like rooms in a building, for instance, versus those that compare it to the narrative arts? For instance, Hepikowski and Darcy, their recent approach to sonata theory is more of a narrative-based approach, and I didn't realize that is so to the extent that it is until I taught a class on musical form for the first time. And I had them make formal diagrams. We were doing that the whole time until we got to sonata form, and I realized this doesn't work anymore, because you don't make a formal diagram of a novel, right? It's about novel goals. It's not about putting the sonata form into blocks. It's not an architectural understanding, it's more about certain goals that are or are not achieved along the way. Do you think that's a significant difference?
I think music can be all of those things, and if you're a Russian formalist or a structuralist critic, then you will make diagrams of novels, because you see the working of a novel in terms of the internal workings of the various parts in the whole. And that's a valid way of looking at it, it seems to me, but so is the other. I think both of them are always taking place. It is our apprehension always includes both modes. And they only can be separated, as you do in your classroom, in a laboratory situation, which is what a classroom is. I'm glad you said you didn't disagree with me that form is something that we impose mentally on what we're listening to. But I don't mean by that, of course, that you shouldn't study form, the way I'm sure you teach it, or the way Taruskin and Hearty write about it. Well, maybe I do have some objection to what they write, in that they tend to be so taxonomic about forms, and makes it really static and really lifeless, and it's really, unrelated to unfolding, even though they do talk about narrative. But I think all of these ways of thinking about music, since they're all mental constructs, are all things that we simply do when we listen to music, and what we're studying when we study these things is our own cognition. Still, composers also cognize, yeah? And so writing about or studying or teaching about musical form is is also in essence a teaching about the process of musical composition. And that's perfectly legitimate, it seems to me. But composers I don't think differ from listeners in the way in which they apprehend the unfolding shape of even their own music, even as they're writing it. Although when you're writing it, if it's actually being written, you can look at your music in spatialized terms, even in the process of composing it. And that's why you get music that really communicates so little to listeners, but communicates so much to analysts, especially a lot of 20th century music is like that. But if you are listening even to a work of Milton Babbitt, sometimes you can get a lovely sense of a narrative. There's a piece of his that I always love to teach, because I always love to teach students how it's possible to hate the music they love and possible to love the music they hate. And for hating the music they love, my favorite example is Carmina Burana. I mentioned it this morning in class. Of course, so many of my students have sung it in high school. They thought it was terrific. And then I thought, actually, that's the original Springtime for Hitler. And they were absolutely astounded. And then they begin to listen more critically to the piece. As one of Milton Babbitt, who's dependably hated the first time around. There's this piece called Composition Before Instruments, you probably know it. And it's composed using a set which generates subsets, but itself only comes once in the piece at the very end. And so the piece has a kind of culmination that you could compare with narrative closure. Even that piece. And once we've been through the tedium of analyzing the serial structure, and they see this thing happen at the end, they get a certain aesthetic charge sometimes, if I'm lucky, from some of them, at the very end of the piece. And I feel like I've done a little bit of the other thing, which is to say there's reasons why people love that music that you hate. And so, I really want people to regard their reactions to the music as much a part of the experience as whatever the composer has contributed. In fact, Friedrich Schiller said something that I've quoted so many times since I first encountered it in one of Charles Rosen's books. He said, what the artist brings to the work of art is finite, but what we bring to it is infinite. In other words, our reaction to it is infinitely variable because we are all individual subjects confronted with the same object. And so our meaning will be different from the artists and from the subjects. So I love to quote that because that shows the role of the apprehender in not only the appreciation of art, but in the creation of the artistic experience.
Unfortunately, we're out of time. Students, please come to lunch tomorrow and all of your questions will be answered. No, I don't know.
Whether
Come
about
to lunch
music
tomorrow.
or about anything else.
Yes, we're going to the refectory. Come see me if you want more details. Thank you for coming.